The morning of Easter is a uniquely joyful and peaceful moment. And yet that peace yesterday was shattered. That's not an overstatement. It was shattered for many observant Christians by a statement that the President of the United States put out at 8:03 a.m. Eastern time on Easter morning that said this, and we're going to read it in its entirety, not in outrage or self-righteousness, but honestly in horror. Quote, Tuesday will be power plant day and bridge day, all wrapped up in one in Iran. There will be nothing like it. 3 exclamation points. Open the fucking strait, you crazy bastards, or you'll be living in hell. Just watch. All caps. Praise be to Allah. President Donald J. Trump. Now, a lot of people reading that imagined, of course, this can't be real. Did the President of the United States really just write that?
What makes you think it's not?
It is maybe the most real thing this president has ever done, and also the most revealing. On every level, it is vile. On every level. It begins with a promise to use the U.S. military, our military, to destroy civilian infrastructure in another country, which is to say to commit a war crime, a moral crime against the people of the country, whose welfare, by the way, was one of the reasons we supposedly went into this war in the first place. They're being killed by their government. We have to rescue them. And now here's our president, not even a month and a half into the conflict, which we are not winning, by the way, because the Straits of Hormuz are not open. There's one way to keep track. That's the measurement. Saying that we're going to use our military to kill the civilians of this country who didn't choose the war. They got nothing to do with it. They're like civilians everywhere. Blow up their bridges? Bridges on military bases? No, just bridges. Bridges that people cross every day to go to school and work and to worship and yes, church, because there are over 1 million Christians in Iran. This is their Easter too. And power plants. Not the power plants attached to missile factories. Okay. But civilian power plants in a country of almost 100 million people. What happens when a modern country, and a country that has a nuclear program is a modern country, Iran is a modern country. What happens when it loses power? Well, people die. Babies connected to incubators die. People in hospitals die. And those are the first level effects. And then people begin to starve. And then you have
so
refugee
pro-life.
crises. People leave the cities looking for food. And then, yes, they move into other countries. In the region, in Europe, in the United States, you cause chaos and death. Mass suffering and death when you do that. And we have done that. We have intentionally bombed civilian infrastructure in Iran. It's totally unacceptable. Not under the phony laws of some international body, but under moral law, God's law, killing non-combatants, people who did nothing wrong, who didn't choose this war, who are just people created by God. That is immoral. That will never be moral. That can never be justified. That is always wrong. It can be expedient. We need to do this. It doesn't mean it's right. It's the most wrong thing. And we should always remember that what we do will be done to us. Live by the destruction of civilian infrastructure. Live by the killing of children, the bombing of elementary schools and colleges. And you will die, and your children will die by those same things.
Bro, talk about scorched earth. Listen, for those that don't understand it, civilian targets are never in play unless they directly support the war machine. The law of armed conflict or international standards on how to behave yourself when it comes to dealing with combatants and non-combatants is really not that hard to understand, right? If people are in harm's way that are not part of the ongoing fight, they're non-combatants. Doctors and nurses and United Nations food caravans, like soup kitchens and hospitals and schools and churches. And these things are off limits when it comes to armed conflict or engagements, bombings, whatever. There are very clear lines on intent, opportunity, ability to do harm when that's presented. Several years ago, when I was in Iraq, I almost shot an Iraqi. Make a long story short, we were outside of our wire, and there was this building where we all went and took pictures, and this guy jumps the fence, right? I was one of the only people that was armed, and I had my entire leadership element with me. And this guy jumps the fence and starts running towards us. And at that point, I couldn't tell whether he had a weapon or a suicide bomb or anything like that. So I aimed my rifle at him. I took it off safe. I called it in. And I said, listen, there's like this imaginary line that I have to draw. And if he comes any closer, then I'm going to have to pull the trigger, because at that point, it is no longer a perceived or assumed threat. It is an actual threat. But I waited long enough for him to basically get to a point where I could clearly see him. And then he saw a Humvee come down the road with a 50 cal on top, and he bugged out. But it was effectively two people that were kind of running up and down the fence line, and one of them jumped the fence and started running towards me. And at that moment, you have to make a decision that, like, you cannot just take a life just because you're in an active war zone, right? That is not a thing that we're allowed to do. And I think Tucker makes a really great point here, talking about moral law, right? Like, what is the right thing to do in that situation? Was that guy in the wrong? Yeah, I probably wouldn't be jumping a fence in an active war zone when I see armed US military personnel. But stupidity does not mean a death sentence, right? Just because you're doing something stupid doesn't mean that I get to kill you for it. So yeah, and I have always heard the phrase that it's better to be judged by 12 than carried by 6. And I get that too, right? In some cases, you have to make a decision, and it's possible that that's the wrong decision. But I think as long as it's fairly clear to understand and to see, you got to make the decision that preserves life and that, does unto others as you would do unto yourself. I don't understand this notion. Like, if you support this, right? If you support bombing civilian infrastructure, let me know in the comments. Like, I simply don't understand. And clearly Tucker Carlson doesn't either.